There are some crimes that do not begin with violence. They begin with small conversations, repeated over and over again. A complaint, a frustration, a feeling of being trapped inside the same house. And over time, those thoughts slowly become something far more dangerous. In this case, what disturbed investigators most was not only the fact that a man was killed inside his own home, it was the way two young people appeared to build a distorted version of reality together, until they eventually convinced themselves that what they were planning somehow made sense. You're listening to Real Criminal Story. On April 21st, 2008, Kristen Jensen stood outside a rehabilitation center in Florida, repeatedly calling her husband. Gary Jensen was supposed to pick her up and drive her home, but he never arrived. At first, Kristen assumed he had overslept. Maybe his phone had died. Maybe he got stuck somewhere on the road. But as the calls continued unanswered, a growing sense of dread began to settle in. Gary had never abandoned her like this before. Not once. And at that moment, Kristen had no idea that inside the apartment she was about to return to, investigators would later uncover signs of a crime scene someone had desperately tried to erase. When she finally arrived home, Kristen nearly froze at the doorway. The smell of bleach filled the air. Not the smell of ordinary cleaning, something much stronger, as if someone was trying to cover something up. Shredded paper was scattered across the floor. Furniture looked disturbed. And strangest of all, the bathroom door was completely gone. Imagine walking into your own home and instantly feeling that something has happened there, something no one wants you to see. Then Nicole opened the door. Her daughter immediately burst into tears. Christopher, Nicole's boyfriend, on the other hand, seemed unusually calm. He told Kristen that Gary had argued with someone and left the apartment. At first, the explanation sounded possible, until Kristen noticed Gary's truck was still parked outside. His phone, keys, and wallet were still sitting inside the bedroom. If someone planned to disappear forever, why would they leave everything behind? That was the first moment investigators began to suspect something was deeply wrong. But what stood out even more was the way Christopher spoke. Too calm, too detailed, too eager to explain things nobody had even asked yet. Experienced investigators often say that during interviews, the most suspicious person is not always the one panicking. Sometimes, it's the one who sounds rehearsed. And Christopher sounded rehearsed. As Kristen spoke about her marriage and family life, another picture slowly started to emerge. Nicole had met Christopher online while she was still very young. After a long-distance relationship, Christopher left the military and brought Nicole to California to live with him. Then Nicole became pregnant. Money started running out. The couple eventually moved back to Florida and into Kristen and Gary's apartment. At first, it was only supposed to be temporary, but over time, the small apartment became filled with quiet tension. Christopher had no stable job. Gary disliked his dependence on the family. Nicole found herself caught in the middle. What investigators found especially interesting was that many people described Nicole, before meeting Christopher, as relatively normal. Not violent, not rebellious, no history of dangerous behavior. Which led investigators to an important question. What exactly happened inside this relationship? Because in psychologically manipulative relationships, reality rarely changes overnight. It changes gradually. One person begins insisting that everyone else is against them, that the world treats them unfairly, that only the two of them truly understand each other. Over time, that kind of thinking can create an entirely separate reality, a world where increasingly extreme actions begin to feel justified. And the more investigators listened to Christopher, the more they believed he had built exactly that kind of world. Christopher constantly described Gary as an evil person. But whenever investigators asked what Gary had actually done, the answers became vague. He complained too much. He was disrespectful. He made Christopher feel unwanted. There was no clear evidence that Gary was dangerous, but inside Christopher's narrative, Gary slowly transformed into a threat that needed to be removed. That pattern appears often in psychologically driven crimes. The perpetrator is not only trying to convince others, eventually, they convince themselves first. While investigators continued piecing together the timeline, a call from a local landfill changed the entire case. Gary Jensen's body had been discovered among household trash. He had been wrapped in blankets and discarded with garbage collected from the apartment complex. This was no longer a missing person investigation. It was now a homicide case. What's notable is that investigators did not immediately tell Kristen. Instead, they separated Nicole for questioning. And within a short period of time, Nicole began falling apart emotionally. At first, she tried to remain calm, but piece by piece, the story began unraveling. The samurai sword, the bathroom, the blood, the missing blanket. Then came the detail that completely changed the direction of the investigation. Nicole admitted that the two of them had been discussing the plan for weeks, not hours, not a sudden argument, weeks, which made every later claim about losing control in the moment far less believable. But the more disturbing part was this. According to investigators, the sword was not even the original plan. Christopher had allegedly attempted multiple times to put sleeping pills into drinks belonging to both Gary and Kristen. Stop for a moment and think about that. While Kristen was trying to rebuild her life and recover from addiction, someone inside her own home was secretly experimenting with ways to harm her. What especially stood out to investigators was the way Nicole described these events. She didn't sound like someone reacting to a horrifying decision. She sounded like someone who had lived inside the plan for so long that the line between right and wrong had slowly blurred. And that may be one of the most frightening aspects of long-term psychological manipulation. It rarely begins with extreme requests. It begins by normalizing small steps. A complaint, a joke, a comment like, "Things would be easier if this person disappeared." And gradually, the moral boundary shifts so slowly that nobody notices it happening. Inside the interrogation room, Christopher continued denying responsibility. He claimed Gary attacked him first, that he only reacted instinctively. But then investigators mentioned luminol, the chemical used to reveal blood that has been cleaned away. When forensic teams processed the apartment, the bathroom nearly lit up entirely under investigation lights. Blood appeared on the floor, on the walls, in the hallway, even inside the vacuum cleaner used during cleanup. That was the moment Christopher's version of events truly began collapsing. Because if this had really been nothing more than a split-second act of self-defense, why was the scene cleaned so carefully? Why was the body hidden inside a dumpster? And why had there already been weeks of planning beforehand? Eventually, Christopher admitted to attacking Gary with the sword, but even then, he continued portraying himself as someone who had simply been pushed too far. That is another pattern investigators often see in crimes like this. Many perpetrators do not view themselves as the cause of the tragedy. They view themselves as someone who had no choice. And sometimes, that distorted belief becomes the most disturbing part of all. Christopher was eventually sentenced to life in prison, along with additional years for attempted murder. Nicole accepted a plea agreement and received a lengthy prison sentence herself. But perhaps the most haunting moment in the entire case came during sentencing. Kristen, the person who had lost almost everything, still asked the court for leniency for her daughter. Maybe it was maternal instinct, or maybe part of her was still trying to understand how the daughter she once raised had slowly become someone she no longer recognized. And even today, the biggest question surrounding this case may never have a clear answer. Was Nicole an active participant from the very beginning? Or had she been pulled so deeply into Christopher's distorted psychological world that she eventually lost sight of her own moral boundaries? Because perhaps the most terrifying thing about this case is that nothing turned dark all at once. It happened slowly, so slowly, that nobody inside that apartment realized dangerous thoughts had been quietly normalized long before the night everything changed forever.